What they found deep in the forest after 80 years. A hiker in a Polish forest notices something unusual. The ground has an odd shape, not natural. He starts digging with his hands, just curious. A few inches down, he hits metal. He calls authorities. Archaeologists arrive. They begin a careful excavation, and what they find takes their breath away. It's a German bunker, completely intact, sealed since 1945. When they open it, the air that escapes hasn't been breathed in 74 years. Inside, they find weapons still in their racks, ammunition still in crates, uniforms hanging on hooks, coffee cups on tables, a calendar frozen on April 1945, and in the corner, in what had been the commander's quarters, they find a diary. The last entry is dated April 28, 1945. It reads, "The Russians are coming. We can hear their tanks. Commander says we fight to the last man. God forgive us for what we've done." That's the end. No more entries. The bunker was abandoned or overrun days later. The men who wrote that diary either died or fled. And for 74 years, their last words sat in the darkness, waiting to be found. Welcome to Echoes of W2. Today, we're going to tell you about discoveries made in forests across Europe and Asia. Bunkers that haven't been opened in 8 decades. Tanks swallowed by trees. Diaries written by soldiers who never made it home. And bones, thousands of bones, finally being identified and given proper burials. World War II ended 80 years ago. But the war isn't over. Not really. It's still there, buried under leaves and dirt and decades of forest growth. And every year, people find pieces of it. Some discoveries are historical treasures. Some are heartbreaking. Some are dangerous. All of them tell stories that history books never recorded. Your history teacher taught you about the big battles, the famous generals, the turning points of the war, but they didn't tell you about what's still out there, still hidden, still waiting to be discovered. Today, you're going to learn what happens when the forest gives up its secrets. Let's start with the most common discovery, unexploded ordnance. Because this isn't just historical curiosity. This is ongoing danger that kills people every year. In Germany alone, authorities dispose of approximately 2,000 tons of unexploded bombs every year. That's not a historical figure. That's current. Right now, 80 years after the war ended, German cities still evacuate neighborhoods regularly when World War II bombs are discovered, during construction projects. But it's in the forests where things get really interesting, because forests weren't priority targets for clearance after the war. Cities were cleared, roads were cleared, farmland was cleared, but vast stretches of forest were simply left alone. Whatever bombs, shells, mines, and ammunition landed there during the war stayed there. In 2020, drought conditions across Europe caused water levels in lakes and rivers to drop dramatically. In a reservoir near the German-Polish border, the low water revealed something that had been submerged since 1945. A massive ammunition dump. The Nazis, retreating from advancing Soviet forces, had dumped thousands of artillery shells, bombs, and small arms ammunition into the lake rather than let it fall into enemy hands. For 75 years, it sat at the bottom of the lake. Then the drought exposed it. Bomb disposal experts spent 6 months removing the ordnance. Much of it was still live, still capable of exploding. One expert said, "We're essentially defusing bombs that were made to kill my grandparents. They've been waiting underwater for 3/4 of a century, and they're still deadly." The forests of Eastern Europe are particularly dangerous. The Eastern Front saw some of the most intense fighting of the war. Millions of shells were fired, bombs were dropped, mines were laid, and much of this happened in forests that remain largely unchanged today. In Belarus, which was occupied and then liberated during brutal fighting, it's estimated that 10% of the country's land still contains unexploded ordnance. That's an entire country where you cannot safely walk through large portions of forest, because there might be a 75-year-old mine waiting under the leaves. People die from this regularly. Mushroom hunters, who go deep into forests looking for wild mushrooms, occasionally trigger mines or pick up unexploded shells, thinking they're interesting artifacts. Children find grenades and try to open them. Construction workers hit artillery shells with excavators. In 2021, near Kursk in Russia, site of the largest tank battle in history, a farmer was plowing his field when his plow hit something metal. It was a German aerial bomb, buried 3 feet underground. The impact detonated it. The farmer died instantly. 80 years after the bomb was dropped, it finally killed someone. This is the reality of World War II discoveries in forests. It's not all archaeological treasures and historical insights. It's danger. Unexploded weapons that have been corroding underground for decades, becoming more unstable, more unpredictable, more likely to detonate from the slightest disturbance. But beyond the danger, there are the artifacts, the objects that tell stories. And some of the most compelling discoveries have been complete military installations, sealed and forgotten. In 2017, urban explorers in Poland found an entrance to what appeared to be a bunker system near the town of Mamerki. They'd been using metal detectors, looking for war relics, when they detected an enormous mass of metal underground. They dug down and found a steel door. Behind it was a staircase descending into the earth. They'd found one of Hitler's Eastern Front headquarters, a massive bunker complex built in 1940 and abandoned in 1945. The complex consisted of over 200 rooms spread across multiple underground levels. When the explorers entered, they found it largely intact. Electric cables still hung from ceilings. Ventilation systems were still in place. Furniture remained in offices. Maps hung on walls, showing front lines that no longer existed. In one room, they found a wine cellar. Bottles of wine from occupied France, brought to this remote Polish forest for German officers to enjoy. While planning operations against the Soviet Union, most of the bottles had degraded, but a few were still sealed. The wine was 75 years old, stored in an abandoned bunker, waiting for a party that would never happen. In the command center, they found something more sobering. A large table with a detailed map of the Eastern Front. Markers still showed German and Soviet positions from early 1945. You could see the German lines collapsing, Soviet forces advancing on all sides. The map was a snapshot of Germany's impending defeat, abandoned when the bunker was evacuated. Most haunting were the personal quarters. In what had been officers' rooms, they found personal effects. Letters from home that were never sent. Photographs of families that the officers would never see again. A diary entry that ended mid-sentence, as if the writer had been interrupted and never came back. These aren't ancient ruins. These are spaces where people lived and worked within living memory. People whose families might still be alive, whose grandchildren might see these discoveries and realize, that was my grandfather's unit. Now let's talk about tanks. Because forests across Europe are full of them, swallowed by vegetation, buried under decades of soil and leaves, waiting to be rediscovered. In 2000, a group of Russian archaeologists was surveying a forest near Leningrad, now St. Petersburg, when they noticed an unusual mound. Trees were growing at odd angles, as if the ground beneath them had shifted. They began excavating. What they found was a complete KV-1 heavy tank, buried in what had been a swamp. The tank had gotten stuck during the Leningrad siege in 1941. Unable to extract it, the crew had abandoned it. Over 60 years, the swamp had dried up and forest had grown over it, completely concealing the 45-ton tank. The remarkable thing, when they excavated it, the tank was in extraordinary condition. The swamp had preserved it. The metal hadn't rusted significantly. The rubber on the tracks was still flexible. Even the engine, after cleaning and minor repairs, could be started. Inside the tank, they found the crew's personal effects: rations, ammunition, tools, and photographs. Pictures of the crew members, tucked into spots around the interior. Young men, some looking barely 20 years old, who'd driven this tank into combat and then had to walk away when it got stuck. The archaeologists were able to identify the crew from the photographs and unique markings on the tank. They tracked down family members. One of the crew members was still alive, in his 80s. He came to see the tank being excavated. He stood there, looking at the tank he'd abandoned 60 years earlier, and cried. He'd assumed it had been destroyed or scrapped decades ago. Seeing it again, seeing the photographs of his young self still tucked inside, was overwhelming. We thought we'd failed, he said. We lost the tank. We had to walk back to our lines and report it lost. I've carried that failure for 60 years. But here it is. It survived. In a way, we all survived. That tank is now restored and displayed in a museum. But it's just one of hundreds, possibly thousands, still out there, in the forests of the Ardennes, where the Battle of the Bulge was fought. There are still dozens of American and German tanks that were destroyed during the battle, and never recovered. The forest grew over them. Today, you can find them if you know where to look. Rusted hulks with trees growing through them, slowly being consumed by nature. In 2015, a forestry team in Belgium was marking trees for harvesting when they found an American Sherman tank completely concealed by undergrowth. It had been knocked out during the Battle of the Bulge in December 1944. The crew had evacuated, and the tank had been left where it died. When they examined it, they found something remarkable. A message painted inside the turret. Mike was here. Made it out alive. December 18, 1944. If you read this, I survived. Tell my family. The message was signed with a full name. Archaeologists were able to track down records. The soldier had indeed survived the war. He'd gone home to Iowa, gotten married, had children, and died in 1998. His children were contacted. They had no idea their father had left this message inside a destroyed tank in Belgium. The family came to Belgium for the tank's removal. They took photographs next to it. They touched the metal their father had touched 70 years earlier. They saw the message he'd painted, hoping someone would find it and know he'd survived. One of his daughters said, "My father never talked much about the war. We knew he'd been in the Battle of the Bulge. We knew his tank was hit, but we didn't know he'd left this message. It's like getting a letter from him 20 years after he died." These tank discoveries aren't just about military hardware. They're about the people who crewed them. Every tank found in a forest represents men who fought, who survived or died, who had families and lives beyond the war. And sometimes, the discoveries inside the tanks are even more direct. In 2003, a German Panther tank was found in a Polish forest. It had been abandoned in 1945 during the German retreat. When archaeologists opened it, they found skeletal remains inside. The crew had apparently been killed when the tank was hit, and their bodies had never been recovered. DNA analysis identified 3 of the 5 crew members. Their families were contacted. Proper burials were arranged. These men, who'd been officially missing in action for 58 years, were finally laid to rest. But the most personal discoveries are the diaries and letters. Because these aren't artifacts. These are voices. People speaking directly across decades, telling us their experiences in their own words. In 2018, metal detector enthusiasts in Normandy found a metal box buried in a hedgerow. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth, was a diary. It belonged to an American soldier from the 101st Airborne Division, who'd parachuted into Normandy on D-Day. The diary covered June 6 through June 30, 1944. The soldier had written entries every day, sometimes multiple entries per day, describing what he was experiencing. June 6. Jumped at 0130. Landed in a field, alone. Can't find my unit. Heard Germans nearby. Hid until dawn. This is not how we trained. June 7th. Found 3 guys from my company. Still looking for the rest. Fought Germans at a crossroads. Jimmy was hit. He didn't make it. We had to leave him. God forgive us. June 12th. Haven't slept more than a few hours in a week. Food is whatever we can scrounge. Water from streams. We're all sick, but we keep moving. Have to keep moving. The entries continued through June, documenting small firefights, terrified civilians, destroyed villages, friends killed. The writing became more terse as the month went on. Less detail, just facts, as if the writer was too exhausted to elaborate. The last entry was June 30th. Companies down to half strength. Everyone who's still here has been wounded at least once. Captain says we're being relieved tomorrow. Don't know if I believe it. Don't know if I care anymore. Just want this to end. That was the last entry. The diary was buried in the hedgerow, and the soldier moved on. Whether he survived the war, we don't know. The diary had his name and unit, but matching it to records proved difficult. He might have survived and gone home. He might have been killed later in the war. The diary doesn't tell us, but it tells us what those days were like. Not the official history, not the strategic overview, but what one soldier experienced, felt, and thought during the first month after D-Day. The diary is now in the possession of the National World War II Museum in New Orleans. They've made it available to researchers. It's considered one of the most valuable first-hand accounts of the Normandy campaign ever found. In Russia, discoveries of diaries and letters are even more common. The Eastern Front killed millions of soldiers. Many were buried hastily or not at all. Their personal effects remained with their bodies or were scattered by fighting and weather. Every spring, groups of volunteers called diggers go into forests where battles were fought. They search for remains of soldiers, both Soviet and German. When they find remains, they try to identify them and arrange proper burial. Often, they find personal items with the bodies. Letters, photographs, paybooks, and occasionally, diaries. One of the most moving discoveries was made in 2016 near Stalingrad. Diggers found the remains of a Soviet soldier in a shell crater. With the remains was a leather-bound notebook, damaged but still readable. It was a diary kept by a soldier named Dmitry Volkov. The entries covered September 1942 through January 1943, the period of the Stalingrad battle. Early entries were optimistic. Volkov wrote about defending his city, about pushing back the Germans, about how the Red Army would prevail. As the battle continued, the tone changed. October entries described constant fighting, artillery barrages that never stopped, watching friends die. November entries were darker. Food was scarce. Ammunition was running low. The Germans were closing in. Don't know if we'll survive this, but we'll make them pay for every meter. December entries mentioned the Soviet counter-offensive starting, hope returning. The Germans are surrounded now. They're the ones starving. They're the ones dying. Justice. The last entry was January 18th, 1943. Very weak. Haven't eaten in 3 days. But we're winning. We're actually winning. If I die now, at least I know we won. Volkov died on or shortly after January 18th. The battle would continue for another 2 weeks, ending with complete Soviet victory. He didn't live to see the final German surrender, but he saw enough to know his side would win. His diary, his remains, and his identification tags were given to Russian authorities. They identified him fully and contacted surviving family members. His grandchildren attended a burial service where he was laid to rest with full military honors. 73 years after his death, one of his granddaughters said, "We knew he died at Stalingrad. That's all we knew. My grandmother died believing she'd never know what happened to him. Now we have his words. We know what he went through. We know he died knowing victory was coming." These diaries aren't just historical documents. They're the last words of people who never came home. Final letters that were never sent. Messages from the past that waited decades to be delivered. Now let's talk about something darker. The mass graves. Because not all discoveries are artifacts or vehicles. Sometimes, they're people. Hundreds or thousands of people, buried and forgotten. In 2017, construction workers in Belarus were preparing ground for a new highway when they discovered human remains. Not just 1 or 2 bodies, but hundreds. They'd uncovered a mass grave from World War II. Archaeologists were called in. The excavation took months. When it was complete, they'd found the remains of over 1,200 people. Men, women, children, all killed during the German occupation of Belarus. The victims had been shot. The remains showed bullet wounds. They'd been executed and dumped in this mass grave, then covered over. For 72 years, they lay there while the forest grew above them. DNA analysis began. The goal was to identify as many victims as possible and notify surviving family members. It's a process that takes years and may never be complete, but dozens of identifications have been made. One family learned that their great-uncle, who disappeared in 1943, was among the victims. The family had assumed he'd been killed, but they'd never known what happened or where he was buried. Now they knew. Similar discoveries happen across Eastern Europe. The Nazis killed millions of people in occupied territories. Many were buried in mass graves in forests, away from towns, where the executions could be carried out in secret. These graves are still being found. Construction projects, forestry operations, sometimes just erosion revealing what was buried underneath. In Poland, ground-penetrating radar surveys of forests where massacres are known to have occurred have revealed dozens of potential mass graves that haven't been excavated yet. The locations are marked. The graves are documented. But excavation requires resources, time, and careful planning. Each grave might contain hundreds or thousands of victims. Each victim potentially identifiable. Each identification means a family finally learning what happened to someone who disappeared 80 years ago. The Holocaust remains the most documented genocide in history, but there are still gaps. Thousands of people who were killed and buried in forests. Their deaths recorded only in Nazi documents that may have been destroyed or remain undiscovered. The graves in the forests are evidence. They're proof of crimes. And they're also graves that deserve to be treated with respect. The victims deserve to be identified, honored, and properly buried. But there's another category of remains found in forests. Soldiers who died in battle and were never recovered. On the Eastern Front, millions of soldiers died. In the chaos of massive battles, many dead were never properly buried. They were left where they fell, eventually covered by dirt, leaves, and forest growth. The digger groups in Russia and other former Soviet states search for these remains every year. They find thousands of soldiers, Soviet and German, men who died fighting each other, now lying in the same forests, waiting to be found. The process is painstaking. When remains are found, everything around them is carefully excavated. Personal effects, uniform fragments, anything that might help identify the soldier. If the remains are German, they're usually identified through metal ID tags which German soldiers wore. If Soviet, identification is harder because Soviet soldiers often didn't have metal ID tags. Identification depends on documents, paybooks, or other items that survived. When identification is possible, families are notified. Burial services are arranged. German remains are often repatriated to Germany if families request it. Soviet remains are buried in military cemeteries. In 2019, diggers near Leningrad found a group of 15 Soviet soldiers who'd been killed in the same location. They'd apparently been a squad caught by artillery fire. They died together and remained together for 78 years. 13 of the 15 were identified. Families were contacted. A joint burial service was held, where all 15 were buried in the same cemetery, keeping the squad together even in death. One family member said, "My grandfather died with his friends. They stayed together all these years. It's fitting they're buried together too." So why does this matter? Why are we still digging up World War II 80 years later? Several reasons. First, unexploded ordnance is still dangerous. Finding and removing it makes land safe for people to use. This is practical, ongoing work that saves lives. Second, historical value. Every bunker, tank, or artifact found adds to our understanding of the war. Sometimes these discoveries reveal things we didn't know. Tactics that weren't documented. Equipment that was never photographed. the lived experience of soldiers captured in diaries and letters. Third, and most importantly, closure for families. World War II killed tens of millions of people. Many of those deaths were never properly documented. Millions of people are still listed as missing decades after the war ended. When remains are found and identified, families finally know what happened. They can hold burial services. They can have a grave to visit. After generations of uncertainty, they get answers. In Germany, there's an organization called Volksbund-Kriegsgeburtsort, the German War Graves Commission. They search for remains of German soldiers throughout Europe. They maintain cemeteries, and they notify families when remains are identified. Every year, they identify hundreds of soldiers. Every year, families who thought they'd never know what happened to their grandfather or great-uncle get a letter saying he's been found. In Russia, the equivalent organizations are run by volunteers. They receive no government funding. They search forests in their spare time, using their own money for equipment. They do this because they believe the soldiers deserve to be found and properly buried. One digger explained it this way: "My great-grandfather is still missing somewhere. Listed as missing in action in 1942. Never found. I search for other families' missing soldiers because I hope someone, somewhere, is searching for mine." This is the human dimension of these discoveries. They're not just archaeological curiosities. They're not just historical artifacts. They're pieces of people's family histories. Answers to questions that have haunted families for generations. And there's still so much out there. Thousands of soldiers still missing. Dozens or hundreds of mass graves not yet found. Bunkers sealed and waiting. Diaries buried with their authors. Tanks slowly being consumed by forest growth. The forest keeps its secrets. But slowly, year by year, people are uncovering them, bringing them into the light, telling the stories that were never told. In 2022, a German documentary crew followed a team of diggers in Russia. They wanted to film the process of searching for and identifying remains. During filming, the diggers found a Soviet soldier with his paybook intact. The soldier was identified as Ivan Petrov, killed in 1943. The documentary crew tracked down Petrov's family. His daughter was still alive, 97 years old. She'd been 5 years old when her father went to war and never came back. The crew filmed her being told that her father had been found, that he'd been identified, that he would be properly buried. She cried. Then she said, "I've waited 79 years to know what happened to my papa. I thought I'd die not knowing. But now I know. He didn't disappear. He didn't abandon us. He died fighting. And now, he's coming home." That's what these discoveries mean. That's why people still search forests 80 years after the war ended. Because there are still people waiting for their loved ones to come home. This is Echoes of W2. Every year, forests across Europe and Asia give up more secrets. Bunkers are opened. Tanks are excavated. Diaries are read. Bones are identified. And families get answers. The war ended 80 years ago. But the forest remembers. Under the leaves and dirt and decades of growth, the war is still there. Still waiting to be discovered. Still telling stories we never knew. Your history teacher taught you about the war's beginning and end. About the famous battles and turning points. But they probably didn't tell you that the war is still being discovered. That every year, new pieces of history emerge from forests where they've been hidden for 8 decades. Now you know. Now you know that World War II isn't entirely past. It's still present, buried and waiting, and every discovery, whether it's a rusted tank or a soldier's diary, or human remains finally identified, is a reminder that history isn't just in books. It's in the ground beneath our feet, waiting for someone to find it and bring it back to light.